You already know. That's the thing that makes this so hard to talk about and so hard to live with. You're not confused. You're not uninformed. You haven't been waiting for someone to tell you what to do, because somewhere in the back of your mind you've known for a long time. You know what the healthy choice is. You know what the responsible thing is. You know what you need to do to move your life in the direction you say you want it to go. You have known, probably, for months, maybe years, and you still don't do it. Not reliably, not consistently, not in the way that would actually produce the change you say you want. You do it sometimes, when the motivation hits, or the guilt gets loud enough, or the stars align in exactly the right way, and then it falls apart again. And you sit with the version of yourself that knows better and does worse. And the discomfort of that gap between the you who understands and the you who acts becomes one of the most draining experiences in a person's life. This is not laziness. Let's be clear about that right now, because the laziness explanation is convenient and almost completely wrong. Lazy people don't feel the friction of not doing the thing. They don't lie awake, replaying the conversation with themselves about why they should have done it. They don't feel the low-grade weight of accumulated intentions that never became actions. Lazy people don't care. You care. That's the whole problem. You care deeply, and you still don't move. And the caring without moving is what makes it feel so personal, so damning, so like a verdict on who you fundamentally are. It's not a verdict. It's a symptom, and understanding what it's a symptom of is the only thing that actually changes it. Chapter 1. Why knowledge changes almost nothing. There is a belief that has quietly organized much of modern self-help, and it is almost entirely wrong. The belief goes like this: if you understand something well enough, you will act on it. Information plus comprehension plus motivation equals behavior change. Learn the right things, understand them deeply enough, want them badly enough, and the doing will follow. This is not how human beings work. You can know that a conversation needs to happen and still avoid it for months. You can understand exactly what's causing your exhaustion and still not change the habits producing it. You can read every book on discipline and still spend your evening exactly the way you spent it before you read them. Understanding a thing and consistently doing the thing are not just different magnitudes of the same process. They involve entirely different psychological systems, and treating them as equivalent is why so much self-help advice fails people so thoroughly. Here is what the research on behavior change actually shows, and what most motivational content carefully steps around. People do not primarily behave in accordance with what they know. They behave in accordance with who they believe themselves to be. Let that sit for a moment. Your behavior is not driven by your knowledge base. It is driven by your identity, by the deep, often unexamined beliefs you hold about what kind of person you are, what you are capable of, what you typically do in situations like this one. When your identity says, "I am someone who struggles with consistency," every time you sit down to do the thing, you are running against a current. The knowledge that you should do it is there, but underneath that knowledge, louder than it in the places where decisions actually get made, is a story about who you are. And that story says, this isn't really you. You'll try. You might even succeed for a few days, but eventually you'll stop, because this is the kind of person you are. And then you stop, and the story feels confirmed, and it gets a little louder the next time. This is not a character flaw. It is a loop. A self-referencing, self-confirming loop that operates mostly below conscious awareness, using the evidence of your own past behavior against your present aspirations. Every time the loop runs, it gets stronger. Every time you know what to do and don't do it, the story that explains why gets more deeply grooved. But here's the thing about loops. They can be interrupted. They can be redesigned, not by generating more knowledge, not by finding a better technique, not by finally caring enough, but by understanding the actual mechanism that drives the gap and addressing that mechanism directly. To do that, we have to go somewhere that most conversations about productivity and discipline refuse to go. We have to go into the emotional layer underneath the behavior. Chapter 2. The emotion that's actually running the show. Pick something you've been putting off. Something specific, something real. Not a vague category like getting healthier, but an actual concrete thing. The email you haven't sent, the conversation you've been delaying, the project you've had open in a browser tab for 3 weeks without touching, the morning routine you've restarted and abandoned so many times you've lost count. Got it? Hold it in mind. Now ask yourself, honestly, when you think about doing that thing, not thinking about it in the abstract, not telling yourself you should, but actually picturing yourself beginning it right now, today, what do you feel? For most people, the honest answer involves something uncomfortable. Anxiety, maybe, about whether it will go well enough. A kind of dread about the effort involved, or the vulnerability, or the possibility of failure. Sometimes it's something more specific. The fear that starting will mean confronting how far behind you actually are. The fear that committing will mean being held accountable. The fear that doing it seriously, really doing it all the way, will surface the uncomfortable truth about whether you're actually capable of it. None of this is conscious deliberation. You're not sitting down and thinking through a cost-benefit analysis before deciding not to do it. It happens in less than a second, below the level of language, in the part of the brain that makes decisions about what is safe and what is threatening. And that part of the brain has decided, for reasons it has accumulated over years of experience, that doing the thing carries a risk it doesn't want to take. And so it doesn't. And then the conscious mind arrives, slightly after the fact, and generates a reason. I'll do it tomorrow. I need to be in the right headspace. I just don't have enough time today. This needs more planning first. These are not lies exactly. They are rationalizations. The decision has already been made, below consciousness, by the emotional system that is actually running the show. The rational mind just writes the narrative to explain the outcome. This is called the emotional avoidance loop, and it is responsible for a stunning proportion of what people call procrastination, self-sabotage, inconsistency, and lack of discipline. Not all of it, but most of it. And until you understand it specifically, you will keep applying intellectual solutions to emotional problems and wondering why the knowledge doesn't translate into action. The key thing to understand is that the avoidance isn't irrational from the nervous system's perspective. It makes complete sense given the information available to it. That information is your history. The times you tried and it didn't work out. The times you invested yourself in something and felt exposed or judged or found wanting. The times you started with high hope and ended with low self-opinion. Your nervous system registered all of that. It filed it, and it is using it now, running it as a threat assessment every time a similar situation arises. And the verdict is, this involves risk. Let's not. You are not failing to act because you lack information or discipline or willpower. You are failing to act because part of you is trying to protect you from something that hurt before. And that is a very different problem with a very different solution. Chapter 3. The gap between the midnight version and the morning version. Most people who struggle with the knowing-doing gap have met what might be called the midnight version of themselves. The midnight version shows up at the end of a day that didn't go the way it was supposed to, when the quiet arrives and the day's distractions fall away and you're left with just yourself and your thoughts. And in that moment, clarity descends. You can see your life with uncomfortable precision. You can see what you've been avoiding and why, what needs to change and how, what kind of person you want to be, and what it would actually take to become them. The midnight version is articulate, motivated, emotionally honest, and full of resolve. They make lists, they set alarms, They write things in notes apps. They fill the gap between who they are and who they could be with an ache that feels like purpose. And then morning comes. The morning version wakes up tired or slightly anxious or just flat, that baseline grogginess of early consciousness before the day has given you anything to care about. The resolve from the night before exists somewhere in the background, but it's quiet, and the discomfort of beginning is loud. So they check their phone, or make another cup of coffee, or tell themselves they'll start after this one thing. And the day accumulates around them, and the intentions from midnight become the regrets of the next midnight, and the cycle continues. This is not weakness. This is a failure to understand something important about motivation. It is not a stable resource. It is a state, and states change. The midnight version of you has access to emotional fuel that the morning version doesn't. At midnight, the discomfort of not changing is at its most vivid. The gap between where you are and where you want to be feels wide and important. The cost of inaction is front of mind, and all of that produces a feeling of motivation that is real. But that is based entirely on current emotional state, not on actual behavioral readiness. By morning, the emotional state has shifted. The vivid awareness of the gap has faded. The cost of inaction is no longer front of mind. What's front of mind is the immediate friction of beginning, the effort, the discomfort, the vulnerability of attempting. And compared to the path of least resistance, the attempt loses because the fuel that was available at midnight has evaporated. This is why motivation is not a reliable foundation for action. Motivation is a weather pattern. You can't build a life on weather. You need something structural underneath it. Something that doesn't depend on feeling a certain way before it functions. But here's what most conversations about discipline miss when they say this. The solution is not to simply override the emotional system with rigid willpower and sheer force of personality. That works for some people some of the time and burns almost everyone out eventually. The solution is to understand what the emotional system actually needs to feel safe enough to move, and to design your actions around that understanding. The morning version of you is not a lesser version, it is the real version. And the real version deserves a system built for real humans, not for the idealized midnight vision of who you're going to become. Chapter 4. What perfectionism is actually protecting. There is a specific flavor of the knowing-doing gap that deserves its own chapter, because it hides behind something that looks like a strength. Perfectionism. Most people who identify as perfectionists think of it as an excess of standards, caring too much, wanting things to be too good, holding too high a bar. And there is some truth in that. But underneath the high standards, in the place where perfectionism actually operates, is something else entirely. Perfectionism is a protection strategy. It is the elaborate armor that forms around the fear of being found inadequate. Here is how it works. If you don't fully commit to something, if you never quite finish it, never quite release it, never quite give it everything you have, then you can never be fully judged on it. The project that's perpetually almost done is never truly evaluated. The relationship you're keeping at a slight distance can't fully reject you. The business idea that's still in the planning phase hasn't failed yet. As long as you don't go all the way in, you retain the psychological safety net of the unstarted. This doesn't count yet. I wasn't really trying. I haven't shown what I can really do. This is why perfectionism and procrastination so often appear together. They are serving the same function. The perfectionist says, I won't do it until I can do it right. The procrastinator says, I'll do it when the time is right. Both are saying, I'm not ready to risk being seen and found wanting. Both are managing the same underlying fear. And the cruel irony is that this protection strategy guarantees the outcome it's trying to prevent. The person who never fully commits to the work never gets to find out if they're actually capable of it. They spend their life in the anteroom of their own potential, perpetually almost beginning, perpetually almost doing the thing, accumulating evidence, not of their inadequacy but of their avoidance, and interpreting that evidence as confirmation of the fear. See, the story says, I knew I wasn't the kind of person who follows through. But what actually happened wasn't a failure of capability. It was a successful operation of the protection strategy. It worked perfectly. It kept you safe from the risk. And in keeping you safe from the risk, it also kept you safe from the growth, the satisfaction, the self-knowledge, and the life that are only available on the other side of real commitment. To break through perfectionism, you don't address the standards. You address the fear. You get curious about what specifically you're afraid will happen if you do the thing fully and it isn't good enough. You sit with the actual worst-case scenario and ask yourself whether it's survivable. You almost always discover that it is, that the judgment you're protecting yourself from, the verdict of not being good enough, would hurt, but would not destroy you, that you are more capable of surviving failure than the protection strategy is willing to let you believe. And from that place, from an honest reckoning with what you're actually afraid of, something starts to loosen. The grip of the protection strategy relaxes, not completely, not all at once, but enough to move. Chapter 5. The discipline nobody talks about. When people talk about wanting more discipline, they almost always mean the kind you see in certain YouTube thumbnails. The 5 a.m. alarm, the cold shower, the unbroken streak, the rigid schedule adhered to across months, regardless of how you feel, regardless of circumstance. The person who has overcome the emotional system so thoroughly that they no longer need to negotiate with it. They just act. This version of discipline exists. Some people have it, but for most people, it is not the path. Not because they lack the capacity for it, but because the model itself misunderstands how sustainable behavior change actually works. The discipline that lasts, the kind that produces real change across years rather than weeks, is not the discipline of overriding how you feel. It is the discipline of building systems that don't require you to feel a certain way to function. There is a difference. The first model says, feel bad about it, fight through it, force yourself. The second model says, design the environment so the right behavior is the path of least resistance, and then show up to that environment. The first model depends entirely on will. The second model depends on architecture. Here is what that actually looks like in practice. You want to exercise more. The willpower model says, set the alarm, drag yourself out of bed, force yourself through the workout, congratulate yourself for the discipline. This works for a while, then a hard week happens, then you're traveling, then you're sick, then you miss a day, and the streak is broken, and something deflates inside you, and missing a second day is easier than the first. Most people who've tried to build an exercise habit recognize this arc intimately. The architecture model asks different questions. Not, how do I find the motivation to go? But, how do I make not going harder than going? Your workout clothes are laid out the night before. Your gym bag is at the door. You've told a friend you'll meet them there. You've committed to something small enough, 20 minutes, 3 times a week, that the version of you at your worst can still reasonably do it. You've removed the negotiation from the morning. The decision was made last night when the motivation was higher and the friction was lower. You show up in the morning to execute a decision that has already been made, not to make a new one with a depleted nervous system at 6 a.m. This is not a hack. It is an honest accounting of how humans actually work. We are not rational agents who make decisions based on what we know to be best. We are creatures of environment, of habit, of context, of emotional state. We do what is easy, what is familiar, what requires the least resistance in the current moment. Understanding this about yourself and designing your life accordingly is not weakness. It is the deepest form of self-knowledge. The second kind of discipline, the one that lasts, is also characterized by something the popular version of discipline almost never mentions: compassion. The person who is genuinely building a sustained practice treats failure as data, not as character evidence. When they miss a day, they don't catastrophize about what it means about them. They ask, what happened? What made it harder than usual? What adjustment would make tomorrow more likely to succeed? They are a scientist studying their own behavior, not a judge evaluating their own worth. And because they're not catastrophizing, the miss doesn't compound. One missed day stays one missed day. The spiral that turns one missed day into 2 weeks of avoidance never gets started. This relationship with imperfection, this ability to stumble without falling, to fail without concluding, is not something you either have or don't have. It is something you build, and it is built through practice, through repeated experience of recovering, through the accumulated evidence that a miss is not a verdict. Chapter 6. The story you tell about yourself in the gap. You have a story about yourself. Everyone does. A running narrative, mostly unconscious, that organizes your sense of who you are and what you're capable of. This story was written by a long process, by things people said to you when you were young, by patterns you noticed in yourself over years, by the evidence your own history has provided about what you can and cannot sustain. And this story is almost certainly outdated. Most people's self-narratives were substantially formed during periods of their life when they were not yet fully themselves, when the circumstances were different, the resources were different, the understanding of who they were was partial and incomplete. The child who was told they were lazy because their ADHD went unrecognized, the teenager who tried and failed at something important and concluded they were not someone who succeeds at important things. The young adult who had an ambition that didn't work out and quietly downgraded their sense of what they were allowed to want. These experiences wrote chapters, and those chapters became the foundation of the story, and the story became the lens through which every subsequent experience was filtered. Confirming evidence got filed, disconfirming evidence got dismissed, and the story got older, more entrenched, more load-bearing, until now, when it sits underneath every intention you have, quietly shaping the probability of each one. I'm not someone who finishes things. I've always been inconsistent. I'm good at starting, but not at following through. I've tried this before and it didn't stick. These feel like facts. They feel like observations, but they are interpretations. They are one possible story constructed from a set of experiences that could also support other stories entirely. The same evidence that a person uses to conclude, I'm someone who can't stick to things, could reinterpreted support the story. I'm someone who has been trying under difficult circumstances without the right understanding of how behavior change actually works, and is still trying. The difference between those two stories is not just semantic, it is behavioral, because the story you hold about yourself shapes, at a preconscious level, the probability of every action you take. The person who believes they are not a finisher will, in moments of difficulty, have their giving up validated by the story. The person who has decided they are becoming someone who follows through will, in those same moments of difficulty, have their continuing validated by the story. Same moment, different narrative, different outcome. This is not positive thinking. Positive thinking says, believe you can do it and you will. This is something more honest and more sophisticated than that. It says, the story you tell about who you are acts as a gravitational field that pulls your behavior toward or away from certain outcomes. You don't have to believe you're already someone who finishes things. You just have to decide, deliberately and consciously, that finishing things is who you are becoming, and let that story start generating new evidence. The identity change comes first. The behavior follows, not always cleanly, not without setbacks, but it follows. Chapter 7. The Cost of Living in the Gap. There is a price you pay for living in the knowing-doing gap, and it is higher than most people are willing to look at directly. The obvious cost is the outcome you're not producing, the health you're not building, the project that isn't getting done, the relationship that isn't improving. These are real costs, but they are not the deepest ones. The deepest cost is what prolonged inaction does to your relationship with yourself. Every time you know what to do and don't do it, every time you make a promise to yourself and break it, you are making a deposit into a very specific account, the account of self-trust. Or rather, you're making a withdrawal from it. You are providing yourself with evidence, accumulated day after day, that your word to yourself doesn't mean very much, that the commitments you make are negotiable, that the version of you who says, "I'll do it tomorrow," can be trusted about as far as the version of you who said the same thing yesterday. Most people are not aware of this account or how depleted it has become. They know vaguely that they have low self-confidence or poor self-discipline. They may feel a generalized sense of inadequacy without being able to locate its source, but if they were to trace it back, they would find it in this account. In the years of small promises made and broken, of intentions abandoned before they became actions, of the gap between who they said they were going to be and who they actually were. This is not blame. This is cause and effect. The self-trust account empties the same way it fills, through the accumulation of small daily acts, and when it has been emptying for a long time, the effects are profound. The ambitions get quieter. The goals get smaller. The bets you're willing to make on yourself diminish, because somewhere below the surface you have learned that betting on yourself produces a disappointing result. And a smaller life is a safer version of that bet. Something else happens too. The energy that could be going into living your actual life gets diverted into managing the gap, into the internal narrative about why you're not doing it, the guilt about not doing it, the hope that tomorrow you will do it, the disappointment when tomorrow comes and you don't, the recovery from the disappointment, the renewed resolve, the cycle beginning again. This is exhausting in a way that doesn't show up on any external metric. You can look fine from the outside while inside you're burning enormous amounts of energy on a loop that produces nothing, the emotional weight of an unfinished thing. The thing you keep meaning to start, the goal you keep revising downward, the version of your life you keep meaning to get to, is heavier than the actual work of doing the thing. Every honest person who has finally done the thing they'd been avoiding knows this. The resistance before was colossal. The doing was hard but finite. And the moment it was done, not perfectly, not the way the midnight version planned, but done, something lifted that had been pressing on everything for months or years. That thing was the weight of the gap. The gap has a cost, and paying it every day is not actually safer than closing it. It just feels that way. Chapter 8. What starting actually requires. If the problem is emotional, if what sits between knowing and doing is not a lack of information but a tangle of fear and avoidance and outdated self-stories, then starting is not primarily a cognitive act. It is an emotional one. And understanding what it emotionally requires changes how you approach it. Starting requires tolerating uncertainty, not eliminating it, not resolving it in advance, tolerating it. The uncertainty about whether it will work, whether you'll be good enough, whether you'll be able to sustain it, whether the investment of effort will return what you're hoping for. These questions cannot be answered before you start. They can only be answered by starting, and the insistence on answering them first is one of the most common ways the avoidance loop disguises itself as responsible deliberation. There is a feeling that arrives just before you begin something that matters. It is not excitement, or not only excitement. It is a kind of trembling, a hovering at the edge of something, a moment in which the known world is still right there behind you, and the unknown world is right there ahead of you, and you are standing at the threshold between them. Most people